So in beginning creating our landscape, we're going to go to File, New Level, and I want you to go ahead and just create a default level. Now we're going to be creating a default level so that we've got some basic lighting and fog conditions already in there, but I want you to delete this static mesh that we have in the middle. Now, for this session, we're going to be creating a basic landscape, and this is going to take some time. So initially, this is going to go through the creating of the landscape and how to use tools with it, and it's going to be followed by how to develop more complex materials to use with landscapes. And I've got to be, really stressing this point that properly designed materials are what take your landscapes from being like a 3 or a 4 out of 10 to a 10 out of 10. Like they're really the final step that makes it, and a lot of people overlook them. So it's incredibly important that you understand how to set them up. Now in this situation, we're just going to be stepping through the basics of landscapes to begin with, but I want you to go to your landscape under your modes panel, and if I right click and zoom out, I can now see that this is what I have here. Now it's going to look a little bit daunting at first, but I want to go through what we have. We have components, we have sections, and then we have quads. Now, a component is made out of sections, and a section is made out of quads. The amount that your landscape tessellates, so as you move around, the amount of extra detail that it works into its three-dimensional space, is dictated by the number of quads, which is determined by the number of sections. Now, components are what we use for these larger sections, and if none of a component is visible, the entire section won't be drawn. So you've really got to think about how you optimize these, because if you have a lot of components, then if I'm really close to the ground, as I look away, it's more likely to cull them out. For instance, if I was here, it wouldn't draw all of the information that was on this side of the screen. The second I look around, it would. If you look at a piece like this, even though I can only see the corner, it's still going to be rendering the 3D information off screen. But the second I can't see the component, we're good. Now, the problem is that if I was to zoom out, this would actually have more overhead because each of the components render separately, which means we're going to be adding more overhead if we're looking at a lot of the landscape at once. However, if we're going to be looking at it in small sections, you want to have more components. So it's a bit of a trade-off, and you need to understand this before you go into developing. And to be honest, it's one of those things that you're probably going to do a couple of times before you really get it right. Now in this example, I could be setting this up to have 63 by 63 quads and then the number of sections as 2 by 2. But then if I wanted to, I could set the number of components to be 4 by 4. And you can see the divisor between the sections and the components because you can see the different color of the lines. So this is the same size as before, however we have fewer overall components. Now for the time being, I'm just going to leave it on this because this is as good a place to start for the type of situation that we're going to be setting up. It's a reasonably small landscape, and because we're kind of looking down, I'm not too concerned about the overall loading. It should be okay. But I've created this, and now I'm going to reach over here and see that we have this button that says Create. Pressing this is what switches it into an actual object. At the moment it's just like a potential landscape. Now, it's worth noting that if all of these numbers confuse you, you can look at Epic's website and go through and view the documentation for the best suggestions of sizes and component ratios to kind of, get the most efficient use of space. So definitely check that out if you feel like you're in deep water here and you're not sure how to proceed. But for the meantime, just follow my lead and press Create. So upon pressing Create, it's going to create the actual landscape itself. Now, don't be concerned about these black lines. These black lines are the result of us not having built lighting yet. If I was to view this in unlit mode, you can see that there are no black lines. They're purely temporary until we have lighting in place. Now, I actually don't want to go any further without doing that, so I'm just quickly going to go back into place mode. I'm going to type in light mass, and I'm going to add a light mass importance volume. I'm going to set its location to be 0, 0, 0, and now I'm just going to scale this up to be the size of the landscape. So I'm going to set this to be 60,000 by 60,000, and in terms of height, I'm going to set this for the time being to be 5,000 is probably not good enough. Let's go 10,000 just in case, and we might even turn this up a little bit more. And normally I would hit build, but it's going to take a little time for me to do so. So if you would like to, you can hit build and then continue on. It'll just get rid of these lines. But in the meantime, I've done this for future use, and I'm going to go to my landscape, and let's start looking at the sculpting tools. Now, to begin with, your sculpting tools, if you've ever used Photoshop, they essentially use most of the same hotkeys as Photoshop, so keep that in mind as it makes life way easier. In this case, we have Sculpt, Circle, and Smooth are all set up as our tool is the Sculpt tool. Circle refers to the type of brush we have, and Smooth refers to the kind of fall off. So if I were to look at my landscape, I could test this tool out by holding down left click to just paint straight onto the landscape. And you can see that this is a great way for me to start setting up some external hills around my map. Now if I was to hold down Shift left click, you can now see that it does the opposite, and I'm now carving holes into my map. So this is very, very useful because I can just carve out an entire arena and have everything looking great in no time. I can also use the square brackets on my keyboard, or I could use this to change the brush size. And this is great because I can set the size to be substantially larger to quickly paint more of the environment. Just be careful about going too large, because if you do so really quickly, it can kind of get out of hand without you realizing it. Sometimes you have more fun than you really should be for these kinds of things. So I'm going to paint this into the environment and just have a general setup, but let's start looking at some other tools that I could use to accompany this. In this situation, I'm going to go back to the Sculpt tool and I'm going to try something else. Let's have a look at the Flatten tool. So when I use the Flatten tool, if I was to click here and drag across, wherever I clicked on initially, it's going to flatten the environment out to be at the same height as that. So I can use this to easily carve out sections, and it'll raise them up or lower them down, whichever is required. But I can use this to create easy plateaus or pathways, and that's fantastic. The other thing that I can do with this that I think is very important to note is that when I click here, you can see that it's flattening, but it has this kind of ramping off around where this fall off area is, so the outermost circle. If I was to click that, it doesn't just flatten that section down. However, if I was to go to here and set the brush fall off to 0, I would remove all of it. And if I looked at this, you'd now see that we have an incredibly sheer wall where that drops off. By the same token, if I went the other direction and had the fall off set to 1, it's now going to be smoothly kind of going in. This is more prevalent in other tools than just the Flatten tool. You can use it in all sorts of areas, but it is worth keeping in mind. So now that we've looked at the Flatten tool, let's cover the Ramp tool. This is one of those things that somehow no one seems to know exists, but it's kind of amazing. If I get the Ramp tool and I click here, and then I click up here, it'll draw out a ramp in space. Why is that great? Well, if I click Add Ramp, it'll automatically add in a flattened landscape between position A all the way up to position B. And I'm sure you can see why that would be useful in a lot of situations when you're crafting out an environment. Now, if I click, it's always going to go from where that base point was. However, if I want to, I can click Reset to clear the first point. So this is very, very useful. And while it is called Ramp, keep in mind that if I was to go to my Sculpt tool and I was to paint something from here and something to here, while it is called Ramp, there's no reason that I couldn't have a reasonably flat road going from A to B and add it that way. And again, there's the amount of fall off that you add. So if I undid the previous addition and I got the fall off and did it this way, you can now see that with basically no fall off, it's an incredibly smooth line straight up and straight down. However, if I went the other way and set it to 0, we would have shear walls on either side. So very useful Ramp tool. No one seems to know about it, but now you do. So next up, we're going to look at some of the other tools that are quite useful. There's a time to use them and a time not to, and it's one of those things that you're really going to get a feel for as you work with them. Essentially, they simulate erosion. So they simulate what would happen over time to an environment. And if I just paint this in there, you can see that it's painting in these little changes, just this little bit of noise that's determined by where the current ramps are and everything else. If I go to something like this, which has a strong profile, and I erode it, you can see that it immediately starts smoothing out the sides, creating little lines of noise around them. And it's a good way to get something that looks a little more natural. However, it's very easy to carve into the world. That said, we can kind of mitigate that a bit by looking at how it's set up. If I get the noise, at the moment it's set to lower, but if I wanted to, I could set this to only raise. So it'll do the erosion, but it'll only do the erosion that lifts it up. It'll ignore anything that's lowering the environment. Alternatively, I could go to both, and I could paint in so that it both drops sections and raises sections. This is really going to depend on the kind of environment that you're after and how you want it to look, but it is a very useful tool for getting a much more natural look to your mountains and hills. Now the next thing that I'm going to go to is hydro erosion. Now this simulates what would happen if rain was to fall on these areas, and it works in a very similar way to the standard erosion, in that I can just kind of paint this in, and it's going to carve out around these dips. It's a bit hard to see right now. I'm just going to quickly go to my world outliner, which is over here, and I'm just going to set my light source to be movable for the time being, which will get rid of all of those lines and put it into a dynamic lighting environment. But you can see that by using the hydro erosion, it's created far more substantial dips. But again, I can change this to be either dipping and raising or just raising. There's no purely negative one for this one. So if I set this, we can have some other effects that can kind of kick in there. But I do recommend checking out the hydro erosion tool. I use it in moderation. So instead of holding it down like I was there, I find kind of like clicking a little bit and letting go and letting it kind of carve out that nice groove, and then moving on with regular erosion works reasonably nicely. If I go towards the bottom of any hill, it's always going to start creating these kind of effects over time. And you can change things like the amount of rain that it's simulating pouring onto the landscape and turn it down a bit, which can create a far, less aggressive effect. It's all up to you. Next up, we're going to be looking at some of the other tools. We're going to be focusing on how to copy and paste and how to mirror, as well as how to select regions. But we'll be doing them in the next tutorial.